Hello, welcome to the bonus material from the Canada interview in Conservation Conversations. This is where we give Dan a bit of an extra chance to have some extended answers on oil and pipelines in Canada, or a little bit more on Belize, and a little bit more on politics, and many more. Enjoy! And in Canada, as I understand, it's quite heavily oil exploited, particularly around places like Calgary and various other things. So, in terms of that, where have you seen in Canada sort of, either conflicts or conservation working well with exploitation of the land and that kind of oil, and particularly pipelines, I understand, are quite a big issue.
Yeah, certainly. That without a doubt, the biggest source of conflict in Canada is over pipelines and the oil sands.
Mm,
There are proponents on both sides of the issue and of the conflict, but hands down, this is the most um, the most hot topic issue in the environmental field, but as well
yeah.
as just in the general life. For those of you who don't know, oil sands are loose sands that are naturally a naturally occurring mix of sand, clay, and water, which is soaked in this really, really heavy, thick, viscous form of oil known as bitumen.
Hmm.
And it is much more difficult to extract the oil than traditional crude oil that you would find in the ground. So there are numerous deposits of this bitumen throughout the world, but the largest are in Canada and Venezuela. And in Canada, the largest ones are found in Alberta, in what's known as the Alberta tar sands or the oil sands.
Yeah.
And the oil sands, they're actually larger than all of England. So you can
Wow.
imagine, yeah, you can imagine how intense and how much resource extraction, how resource intensive it is
Yeah.
for this particular environment. And that kind of gives you an idea also of the importance in terms of uh, the economy and the use of this oil and why there is such a conflict. I mean, if only 30% of the oil was extracted from the tar sands, it would be able to supply North America with enough oil for the next 100 years.
Wow.
So yeah,
That's a
so
hell of a
so
stat.
yeah, so it really that really shows I think paints a picture at the heart of the conflict there. You have this naturally
Incredible
occurring
resource.
resource
Yeah.
that is, can bring in so much money to the economy, which can then be put towards other uses that there are serious proponents for this, and it just continues to remain one of those hot topic issues.
Yeah.
Uh, and then in order what and the reason it aside from the fact that it's just so large, the reason that it's so destructive is that the oil, the bitumen, when it needs to get extracted, because it's so heavy and viscous, you need to have to refine it and be able to
Mm.
take the oil and separate the oil from the rest of the sand and clay. However, because it's so thick, it needs to be able to be heated up to transport it.
Yep.
So you need natural occurring gas or lighter oil in order to make this transportable. However, if these aren't found on site, you need a
You got to
pipeline
bring
to
them
bring
in.
them to site.
Right.
Then you need a separate pipeline to get the oil to just allow it to transport to a refinery.
Okay.
And only then do you begin the refining process and separating it and getting the oil. Then the oil is piped through pipelines to wherever else it's needed, to the coast, to
Wow.
wherever.
I hadn't appreciated that it was so much. There's so many varieties of pipelines of bringing oil into a place where you're trying to extract oil. And
Yeah,
perhaps naively, I just thought it was pipelines to bring oil out of where it was being produced. But yeah,
and that's one of the biggest issues as well. Canada doesn't really have any refineries to be able to do this.
mm,
So we'll extract the oil, send it to refineries in the States, and then purchase the oil back from the States. So it's
right.
this really backward system. Um, but I mean, it is what it is, unfortunately, at this point. And there are people fighting to shut it down and to stop pipelines, to stop all the pipelines. But even aside from the pipelines, so intensive to be able to extract it. You need all this water. So it takes about 700 liters of water to produce 1 barrel of oil from the tar sands.
Wow. Okay.
So not only is it using so much water, it also emits and contributes to the greenhouse gases so significantly, so much more than traditional crude oil. So 30% more greenhouses are produced from this production than conventional oil.
Yeah.
It actually contributes 40 million tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere a year. I mean, just from this one particular industry within one province of Canada.
That's
So
yeah. That's pretty staggering. Even with the forests, I guess you're not taking that out of the atmosphere every year. So
exactly. So even though we do have such a large forest system, it we need it, and you can imagine how much worse things would be if we didn't have that.
yeah.
And and that's just the tar sands. Then we still have other pipelines from other mines and oil deposits elsewhere. So Canada has about 1 million kilometers of pipeline crisscrossing the country, and obviously this brings inherent risk for spills and
Yep.
damage to the environment, the ecosystem, human health as well. So this has brought even more conflict into the matter with, especially with indigenous communities. A lot of these pipelines are built in traditional indigenous communities, and a lot of the land is unceded. And what that means is that Canada, indigenous people just didn't sign any treaties with Canada, with the Canadian government, so
Right.
that land is still theirs.
Yeah.
So there's real issues because the Canadian government is still forcing and trying to push into those territories, and there's been a lot of conflict with indigenous groups. And even as I'm speaking, like just last week, there were Royal Mounted police officers physically removing indigenous elders from their land so they can continue with the construction of these pipelines.
Yeah,
So
that's not the image we have of the Mounties, but yeah, I did read that, so it's pretty heavy stuff. I mean, you mentioned sort of moving on to the next one. You mentioned there's the risk of oil spills in Alberta and all that kind of stuff. One of the other syllabus points we have to talk about is the impact of artificial human extracted chemical inputs onto the land. So what does the sort of effect of the oil industry or other industries look like on the land when it goes wrong? What happens there?
so in terms of the oil industry, I mean, there's there's these things called tailing ponds, and they're a byproduct of the oil industry, and they're really these toxic ponds of wastewater that's the byproduct of the extraction process,
Mm-hmm.
and they become essentially like desolate wastelands. And again, if you can think of a giant open pit mine uh, bigger than the size of England, you can get a visual imagination of how
Yeah.
destructive it is. And that's just one industry. I mean, so that's one example. Another one I would say, and you might be familiar with this as well, would be Monsanto's use of glyphosate
Yeah.
in their herbicide Roundup. So again, same thing. That is used for crop management, and Monsanto discovered that it was actually a really good herbicide. So farmers started to use it, really heavily used, which caused serious effects, especially on humans and human health.
Mm.
So in 20, I believe in 2015, there was a direct link made between uh, the chemical as well and cancer. So it was determined that it was a carcinogenic. However, despite this, Canada continued to use it. The U.S. continued to use it. Even the EU continues to use it. And just recently, actually, in a couple of years ago, it came to light that Monsanto was fabricating studies and falsifying evidence and
Wow.
records that covered up the link between uh, cancer and the Roundup.
Yeah, there's a big ongoing trial about that, isn't there? So there's ongoing legal action in the US and
Yeah,
in the
the
EU about that.
Yeah, and one gentleman was awarded, I think, like $30 million
Mm.
or potentially even more, just the other year for it. And after this, though, once this came to light, I mean, France banned Roundup. The EU, it came out that the EU actually relied heavily on falsified studies as well, and they reauthorized it for the reauthorized its use for another 5 years.
Yeah.
And the US EPA, same thing. They have just kind of outright said, nope, we don't think it has any link to cancer. Uh, and so, despite all of this, though, Canada still uses it. We still use Roundup for a lot of crops, and um, that obviously has devastating impacts on human health, but as well as wildlife.
Yeah. So I mean, how do you? I guess the next one is how do you convince people that this kind of thing is important? I mean, in terms of balancing, because people have to farm, they have to eat, they have to live somewhere, and there's a lot of us around now. So how do you, in a North American context, sort of, balance the needs of people with the needs of conservation for people who aren't necessarily specialists?
Yeah, and that's a very valid question. I think it's very similar to what we're seeing happen all over the world. I think one of the biggest things we need to do uh, is build our economy around the environment.
Hmm.
That's being one of the biggest sources of conflict. Is how can the economy needs to take precedent over the environment. That's why you see the oil industry. That's why you see mining. That's why you see all of this. Uh, However, if we shift our focus and shift our mindset to the environment and the economy can be one, I think that is the biggest thing we need to do. And I think this also includes a lot of other aspects. It includes indigenous rights as well, and working with all these different partners to really shift the focus onto clean energy and uh, clean technology. And um, I think that's probably one of the biggest things. And I think in in Canada, at least, we're really starting to see that, and you see that take place in in the political scene as well, where
Yeah.
we have the Green Party, and they have traditionally not really been able to garner much support, but over the past 10 years, let's say, they've become actually a main a main party within the Canadian political system.
Yeah.
And I think it shows that people uh, are caring and are realizing that we do need this. And I think really moving into an economy that focuses on clean energy and clean energy in relation to job creations,
Yeah.
clean energy in relation to putting a price on pollution, carbon tax, taxing plastics, all of this. I mean, I think personally, I think uh, there should be more taxes on things like this. I think if the agricultural industry, if you're going to, I think factory farming should have a heavier tax on it. There should be ways to try to convince industries that have traditionally been resistant to change. I think we need to convince them that change is okay, and it doesn't mean the end of the economy. It doesn't mean the end of their business, and it doesn't mean the end of their way of life.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think that's absolutely the way we should go. And are you seeing much of a difference at the moment between, not to get too overly political, but are you seeing much of a difference between Canada and the US at the moment in terms of the approach to to balancing conservation with people?
So, I mean, I think we've really seen the differences over the past several years, since the current administration in America took over. They really put all of their balance and all their focus onto the economy. They
Mm,
started repealing environmental protection acts. They started uh, delisting endangered species. They started uh, um, fast tracking mining projects, and really getting rid of all environmental regulations or putting those on hold to further the economy. Whereas, and and I think that that's a big difference in Canada. And I think one of the differences there is in the population. We have 36 million people. America has 10 times the
yeah,
population.
300 and something million. Yeah.
So jobs and unemployment, and that is such a bigger factor there. And I think right now that's being seen as a precedent in the States. Whereas Canada, on the other hand, our political leadership that we have now ran and really focused on clean energy, on
Mm.
green technology, on environmental reform and regulation, on indigenous rights, fighting for indigenous rights. And I think, and that is, to me, is the biggest difference, is we have uh, leadership in Canada that focuses and puts the environment at the forefront and addresses it and openly addresses it. And that doesn't mean we don't have a lot to do still, and we don't have a long ways to go. But the leadership in the States, they have chosen not to talk about this, to put it on the back burner, and not even bring it to the forefront
Yeah.
of anyone's attention. And which is sad, because I think the desire of the people and the population is there. You really saw it with the climate marches throughout the summer
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
the year.
I think the view from the European side would probably be very much the same, that we're generally more aligned with Trudeau than Trump. I think is yeah, the sort of feeling over here. A little bit more power, like we all would like if you were in government, or had some kind of snap your fingers power, and you could change something about either people's approach to conservation or something physical in the world. What do you think it would be?
Um, I'd remove Donald Trump. No.
Good answer. Well, hopefully,
Uh,
hopefully Joe Biden will do that for us. So
yeah,
yeah,
hopefully. As easy as it would say to, it would be to say I would just protect all of the wild areas, all the forests and everything like that. Uh, I think it is way more complex than that. And again, this kind of ties back to what we were saying. I think there's so many different challenges, so societal, environmental,
mm,
economic issues, and problems that really that underlie the fabric of our society, and North America in particular. And we're seeing that now, when with racism, inequality, poverty, homelessness. And I think uh, with this, it's really difficult for people to focus on the environment. So I think we need a complete overhaul of the education system, so that and our social construct, so that we stop teaching some of these outdated subjects and start focusing curricula around the environment, around how the environment can really tackle a lot of these systemic issues. We need to start talking about the green economy. We need to start talking about indigenous rights. We need to start talking about equity and equality. I mean, you see some of the most important environments in the world: Amazon rainforest, northern Canada. They're the populations. They're the ones that probably are the hardest hit by climate change, by all of this, and we need to we need to be equitable with how we distribute these resources. And I really think if we can overhaul our education system and start shifting that focus,
yeah,
I think this can really lead to uh, reshaping our society, and to one that is more environmentally centered and friendly. And I think by focusing the economy and conservation principles around ecological practices, such as, yeah, like we said before, green technology, reduced meat consumption, factory farming, things like that, I think that is the biggest thing we can do. I think we also need to start valuing our wildlife and our wild areas, and building laws that are aimed at protecting these assets, holding people accountable uh, who misuse and expropriate these resources.
yeah.
I think we really need to, yeah, start holding people accountable for the damage that they're doing to the environment.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. So if I can take you to a completely different country, this was news to me when I first reached out to you to have a go, to be involved in this. But your latest project is in a completely different country. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your field center, that your field station that you're trying to set up in Belize? I mean, that sounds like a fantastic project.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
this is something I'm very excited about. To give a bit of a background, I know we discussed this already briefly, but
mm,
uh, my wife and I, we have always been interested in conservation, and it's always been our dream to set something up like this. We uh, met people and we knew people who a couple also Canadians. Uh, they went and purchased 200 acres of forest in Belize, and their whole idea was to protect that and essentially have their little slice of paradise where they
mm,
can do all the research they want and just explore their own interests. One of them is an ornithologist, the other one's a herpetologist. So that was their idea, and they did that about 8 years ago. They, for the past 8 years, have spent building it up, putting in the infrastructure, managing it, forming relationships, and they've really got to the point where they kind of hit their limit, and they would like other they need help to grow it. So
yeah.
they've asked us to be involved, and they have a field station in Belize. It's Belize is one of the most important actually areas in the Americas for biodiversity, not only in the forest, but it also has outside of Australia the biggest coral reef system in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, the
Incredible.
Mesoamerican reef. It,
Yeah.
it, it stretches. It's the same one that's connected to Mexico, goes
Mm,
down the Americas, all throughout there. Um, so it's just a country that really drew us to it, and really drew our interest. And so right now we are working to set up an NGO, a non-governmental organization, so that we can start to apply for funding and start bringing in researchers, PhD students, master students, high school groups to really get hands-on experience working in the field, working in the forest, working with scientists, working with local communities. That's one of the big things. It kind of ties all of this back in with our passion with community-based conservation, wildlife management, and the environment.
mm,
We're going there to work with the local communities to uh, again use conservation and conservation tourism as a tool to protect the environment, to provide jobs, to provide incentives to local communities to want to protect their land. I mean, Belize, it only has a population of 300,000 people, so it's tiny in terms of numbers. They only have four highways, so
wow.
you can
Okay.
imagine like most of the people live in rural areas. So they, again, as we mentioned before, they traditionally lack access to a lot of the same luxuries and resources that we take for granted. So helping them and going again working alongside them to establish different businesses or different avenues, such as maybe we'll help them grow crops and have
Yeah.
some sustainable agriculture, and we'll bring in tourists or school groups to work with some of the local guides and the local scientists and researchers to again conduct research on there. And the whole goal would be to be able to continually bring in funding to continue to do research in this area. Belize is actually has one of the highest population of jaguars in the entire world,
Wow.
so that really strikes an interest and strikes a fancy with
Yeah,
me.
yeah. No, definitely for me. I mean, one of my strongest memories of Ecuador is you and I finding the first picture of the jaguar in that area of the interior of Ecuador, and actually finding that off the camera trap. And you and I were the first people to see a jaguar, if only a picture, in that area, and that was a brilliant conservation moment. So, yeah, if you could,
Yeah, me too. It was like a eureka moment
yeah,
almost. I mean, it was, yeah, it was fantastic.
yeah,
So, and that's exactly what we're trying to do in Belize, and with COVID and the COVID situation, that's put a little bit of a delay in things, but
yeah.
we still hope to get that up and running in you know by next year, and hopefully the travel restrictions will be over. We'll start to be able to bring some groups in next year or the year afterwards. There's always a spot for you guys
Yeah, man. What do
anytime you want.
you think, guys? We'll go down. Yeah. I'm sure we'll have plenty of interest in going off to Belize. Absolutely. Okay, so who wants to go to Belize? I know I do. So a fascinating interview there with a fascinating conservationist. Next up, we're discussing agriculture in the UK and Transylvania. See you then.